In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. Now, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
More than 3 years ago, in what now feels like a blink of an eye, a group of Eastham locals gathered together to make sure that one of the most defining dates in our history, the first encounter, was revisited and acknowledged. Coming from the business community, my focus looked to the monetary windfall that this quadricentennial could realize for our community. The rest of the group was far more pragmatic and concentrated on events surrounding this period in American history. Little did I know that I would be drawn into their web of intense research and become their devout follower. The group spent months formulating a plan that would lead up to a year of programming that addressed the many causes and effects of the Mayflower voyage and its passengers, and the indigenous people that had been living here for thousands of years. In 2018, we were successful in convincing the select board of the town of Eastham to form a committee that would ensure the significance of this American legacy. They armed us with funding and charged that the Eastham 400 Commemoration Committee shall develop a historically accurate acknowledgement of events surrounding the first encounter and present it through educational programs, activities, events, promotional materials and merchandise, and projects. These programs and materials will relate to life prior to, during, and after the first encounter, and will deal with both the Nauset tribe of the Wampanoag Nation as well as the Pilgrims. The programs will be of clear mutual interest to the residents and visitors of the town of Eastham and be respectful of the history being acknowledged. We reached out to others that would benefit from our focus and found many partners that shared our objectives, which they would pursue in their own particular medium. The results, in spite of the sudden insurgence of a global coronavirus pandemic, were a packed schedule of programming for the year leading up to the 400th anniversary of the first encounter. A website, eastham400.org, to document and archive our programs and findings, and exquisite commemorative items that will become keepsakes for generations to come. The film, Eastham 400, Our History Restored, that you're about to see is a melange of video clips from the Eastham 400 Sunset series and Campfire series. The excerpts that we have selected to include in this film provide a general overview of the committee's commitment to research and reveal a more accurate Eastham history prior to, surrounding, and since the first encounter at Nauset. The complete collection of each of the more than 100 videos can be accessed and viewed at eastham400.org. Please enjoy the following film, Eastham 400, Our History Restored. Eastham's role in the story of English settlement on Cape Cod begins with the story of the first encounter. The following clips are excerpts of Ian Saxine's book, The Story of the First Encounter at Nauset, read by Nauset High School alumni Ben Hoops.
During the night of December 7th and 8th, the English heard a great and hideous cry, which stirred them from their sleep and set them to firing off their muskets into the darkness. When the noise stopped, they were convinced it came from wolves or foxes. The English rose before dawn. By this point, the Nauset waited for light and for favorable opportunity to attack. They would have had no doubt as to where the English were camped. Any warrior who needed to help getting his bearings got it when several English began firing their muskets to see if they still worked. The Nauset's attack was well timed, catching the English after they had begun to load their shallop. A number of men left their armor down by the shore before having breakfast in the camp, and some did not have their weapons handy. The English party was divided between the shore barricade they had constructed and the shallop when they had heard a great and strange cry, which Bradford claimed they knew to be the same voices they heard in the night. One of the men who had been out by the boat cried out the alarm as arrows began to fly through the air and the English scrambled to reach their weapons. The shortcomings of the English firearms became evident as soon as the fight started. As only 3 of the Englishmen defending the shallop were able to fire their weapons, the rest needed to light their matches. One of the men defending the barricade carried a log from the fire out to the boat on his shoulder. Even as they filled the air with arrows and war cries, the English found dreadful the Nauset did not charge. Instead, both sides fired at each other from cover. One valiant Nauset the English suspected was a war leader exchanged volleys with them from behind a tree well within musket range. English musket balls sprayed bark and splinters all around them until the man finally joined his comrades in a general withdrawal. While the Nauset attackers would no doubt have liked to kill or capture at least some of the interlopers who were looting their cemeteries, and they may have suspected looking to kidnap more of their relatives, the most important goal for the Nauset warriors would have been driving the unwanted English away from their homes and families. As a result, both sides would claim to have won what the Plymouth colonists started calling the first encounter, and both probably did. The English followed the Nauset for a short distance, firing off a few more muskets and shouting that they might see we were not afraid of them, and knew that it pleased God to vanquish our enemies. The colonists gathered up a bundle of 18 arrows to send to England to show what they were up against. Ironically, a move the Nauset would have approved, as it would have conveyed evidence of their resolve. Despite a number of near misses, none of the English were hurt in the fight, and there is no evidence any Nauset were either. For that, the Nauset could credit the strength of their own spiritual power. Not only did their own warriors emerge unscathed from battle, but soon afterwards the English sailed away in their shallop. That same day, a Friday, a storm broke their rudder and mast, blowing them into Plymouth Harbor. After spending Saturday making repairs and Sunday at prayer, the party went ashore on Monday, December 11th. Soon afterwards, the Plymouth colonists decided to build their town of New Plymouth, not amidst the Nauset, but down the coast among the abandoned cornfields where the village of Patuxet once stood. For the Nauset, that was a victory. But with the English now building a town nearby, only a partial one.
Several decades later, the English returned to found present-day Eastham. We now hear from Patricia Donahoe, an officer of the Eastham Historical Society, about the founding fathers of Eastham.
Could you start by telling us a little bit about who these founding fathers were?
I'd be glad to. The first person I'm going to mention is Thomas Prince, then John Doane, Nicholas Snow, Josiah Cook, Richard Higgins, John Smalley, and Edward Bangs. These were the 7 heads of household.
And did these 7 men move here alone, or did they come with their families?
They did come with their families. There were 49 individuals in all. Some of the women were already having other children. They were pregnant. And so they count the 49 as those who actually were born in Plymouth.
And can you explain a little bit about why these English people decided to move from Plymouth to Eastham?
We think that it was because they were never really satisfied and happy with the land. It was a very interesting place to go to. It had enough room, at least initially it did. But they never were completely satisfied, according to Governor Bradford, who wrote the book on Plymouth Plantation. He said that in his book as a quote. I often think of it as they were just crowded. Their families grew quickly. If you could see these family trees that are on the easel, they started out just being, young couples, and then quickly their families expanded. 2 of the gentlemen were 54 years old, but most of them were about the same age. They were born around the year 1600, and so they were really, productive and having lots of family join.
WGBH reporter Bob C. provides a more detailed explanation of why the colonists moved from Plymouth to present-day Eastham, what was then called Nauset.
The question was, why was there this movement of pilgrims from Plymouth to Nauset back in the 1640s? And it really begins actually in the 1630s when William Bradford, I think, was having some problems governing the Plymouth colony. At 1634, he refused to be reappointed the governor of Plymouth colony, so Thomas Prince was recruited. He served for a couple of years. Bradford came back into power. Then he refused to be reappointed again, so Prince again became governor, and then returned from 1657 to almost 1672 when he died. He was governor of Plymouth most of that time from here in Eastham. But what was happening in Plymouth was that people were having a lot of problems farming, getting enough food, and they were looking around for more fertile land. And they knew that Nauset was a fertile territory because they had been trading with the Indians here. And the Nauset Indians were, I think, the only tribe that was able to produce more grain than they consumed. But what happened was that in 1637, Plymouth allowed the town of Sandwich to be incorporated. And then in 1639, Barnstable and Yarmouth. And I think Thomas Prince and some of his followers in Plymouth, and we should mention that those towns were not settled by residents of the Plymouth colony. They were settled from people from Saugus and other parts of the Commonwealth. But he was concerned, I think he and his followers concerned, that if they didn't act quickly enough, the good land might be gone, and they may lose their chance to stake a claim. So in 1640, actually, was when some land was granted to Thomas Prince and his followers. And I think that the tract of what was called for the Old Comers, and the Old Comers were any of the original colonists who came over on the Mayflower, the Fortune, or the Anne, the first 3 ships, and that included Prince and several other people. So that was the beginning, I think, of their interest in this area. But originally, they had wanted to move the entire Plymouth colony to Nauset. And there was a great deal of debate about whether they could do that. And maybe if they didn't do that, the colony would be weakened by degrees, as they said, of just a few people left. So they came out here in 1643, I think it was, and they looked around and they said there really isn't enough room for all of us at Plymouth. So they basically settled on 7 of the colonists, led by Prince, and they were the original settlers of Nauset. And they were granted the land from the, and this is where it gets a little interesting in terms of how they acquired the land, because the land was basically purchased, they said, from the Nauset Wampanoags, and extended all the way from Yarmouth pretty much up to Provincetown was the original land. So that was in 1644, when we see that date associated with Eastham, I think that's when they actually moved here. But it took until 1646 for them to qualify as a certified township by Plymouth.
Although Eastham 400 is focused on the history of the 1600s, we also acknowledge that our history neither began nor ended with these events. We explore the continued significance of these histories and look at Eastham's story as one part of a much larger process. For example, we recognize that the Mayflower's journey to Cape Cod was neither the beginning nor the end of local migration. In the following video clip, Cape Cod National Seashore geoscientist Mark Adams discusses the ways in which migration on Cape Cod is a common process for both humans and animals. He then explores the big picture of human migration.
And so, here's herring. Here's one of our iconic migrators. Migration is a part of ecology and behavior. The trait of migrating is part of so many animals. Every branch of the animal kingdom has journeys that take place through water and land, swimming, walking, drifting. This is not just a unique biological phenomenon, but it transcends species. And it's one of the defining traits of humans and animals, their mobility, their freedom to move. So just a couple examples of our champion migrators that we see in Cape Cod. The red knot passes through Cape Cod on its Atlantic coastal migration and has this very particular timing where it comes to Pleasant Bay and Nauset Marsh just when the horseshoe crabs are laying their eggs. And if that didn't happen, they would miss one of their essential food sources that allows them to complete their journey and make a new generation of red knots. So the timing of the planet is like an interconnected clock. What is it about humans? We think we're different. We drive cars and we watch TV and our lives are just separate from nature, right? We have a history, and you don't have to go back very far to see the initial spread of humans. As humans evolved in Africa, this is kind of the pattern of dispersal of the various human species from Africa around the world. And it took a very short time. It's a mystery to me why humans have this compulsion to disperse and expand and migrate. I think it's really part of our culture from the very beginning. This shows the sources of human populations in, thousands of years. So you see, if we take 200,000 years as a marker for humans arriving on the planet, within 50,000 years, they're in Europe, and really 65,000 years to get to the furthest corner of the world, which might be Australia. And there we are. The Neanderthals, who kind of were outcompeted by the Homo sapiens. This is kind of the extent of their spread in Europe. And who knows? Maybe one of the reasons why the Neanderthals didn't survive is because they didn't have this compulsion to migrate and disperse around the planet. They weren't adaptable. They weren't explorers and nomads. Again, this is very speculative and non-scientific thinking. But another really traditional kind of migration that's very human, that's very part of our culture, is sometimes called transhumance. And this is very ancient migration pattern involved in a pastoral culture where we herded animals, where we went from the highlands to the lowlands seasonally, following herds of sheep, cattle, even horses. This shows the basically Romania, the Central Europe part, down to Greece, and these patterns of movement over time that really go back many thousands of years, well, several thousand years.
Migration is a topic that stretches across history and continues to be an important part of our society. We now hear from Brazilian immigrant and Cape Cod Community College graduate Elias Furtanani about connections between these histories and his personal migration story.
Well, I came to Cape Cod in 2016, 4 years ago, and I came to learn English and work, and that's what I'm doing. I got married here, so I'm definitely an immigrant here who passed to being a student to a resident. And my story, like here, like when I got here, I didn't know about that Cape Cod would be the first contact with the pilgrims, and this fascinates me.
And do you see any similarities or differences between your story and the story from 400 years ago?
Well, the differences that I see is that are the pilgrims, they came and was a new land, just like the same as me, but the difference are that before there was no streets, there was no civilization at all. Like there was the Native Americans who was living here, but I don't know much about what they were doing and how was that their civilization before the pilgrims, because the pilgrims came and colonized that here. I just think that when I was studying about the pilgrims, and I realized that they had a hard first winter, just as I did. And after the first winter, the second winter, I got to know more people and get to know how to survive better. And that's how you do it. I think like the path is the same in a discovering aspect, but overall, like the pilgrims did a different kind of history. And what I'm trying to do now is like be a part of this community.
Another aspect of local history, one that is often neglected, is that of Native Americans' histories. Aquina Wampanoag Linda Coombs now retells Cape Cod's origin from a Native perspective.
Well, according to our history, I never use the term creation story, because the word story often, is akin to myth and legend or fable, fairy tale, something that isn't real. And our creation is real. My point in that is to try to get out the point that our history and the way that we relate it through, various stories, is just as viable as any other method or any other people's methodology. So, as John mentioned, at one point this was all solid land after the glaciers retreated. And that's at the point that the Wampanoag people, at least as far as we know, we weren't here before that, but that's when we came here. And back in those days, we lived, the edge of the land was where George's Bank is now. And the Ojibwe people lived there. And we had a person called Masha. And that word, I'm not sure if it's the exact word from the Wampanoag language, but it means great man or large man, because he was a giant. And unlike the rest of us humans, he was made directly by the Creator. Okay, not born of woman, but made directly by the Creator. So he was almost like the Creator. And giants could be 40 to 60 feet tall, or the size of the tallest pine tree, which are our ancestors, by the way. And they could be 150 to 200 feet tall. And I think Moshup was in that latter category because they could grab whales. They were large enough to grab whales by the tail, and we know that Moshup did that because on Gay Head or Aquina we have a lot of stories about how Moshup fed the Wampanoag people with whales. And the water rose one day because Moshup dragged his toe and the water came in. And it rose to the point where it left the Cape and the islands pretty much the way it looks now. And at some point, I'm not sure I don't have the exact dates lined up in my mind to tell you, but apparently there was a lot of fighting going on the mainland, and so Masha basically said, well, I gotta get to a place that's a lot more quiet and peaceful, and anybody that wants to come with me is welcome to come. And so that's when he went over to what is now Aquinnah or Gay Head and out to the cliffs. I don't know if anyone's been out to the cliffs, but they're very famous because they're made of colored clay, red, yellow, black, and white, essentially. In those days, the cliffs were all white. And they later became colored because, as I said, he was catching whales, and he would smack the whales against the cliffs, and their blood would stain the clay red, the red clay. And then he would cook the whale meat, and that's how he fed the Wampanoag people. And the black clay or gray clay comes from the ashes from his fire. And a few years ago, they moved the Gay Head Lighthouse 135 feet inland so it wouldn't topple over the cliff. And there were a number of archaeologists and geologists involved in the whole move and everything, because some very unusual features were revealed when the lighthouse was lifted up and actually moved. And one of those gentlemen, a man by the name of Byron Stone, who's a geologist, came and spoke at the Aquinnah Cultural Center, which is just across the Aquinnah Circle from the lighthouse, about this one very, strange anomaly, geologically speaking. And he reacted to these mash-up stories like many people, that, oh yeah, those are fairy tales, they don't mean anything, they're just for entertainment. And when I was talking about the red clay being from the whale's blood, he was like, well, there is an element in that clay that's like blood or iron. And the black clay, he says, it does have some sort of chemical element in it that is akin to charcoal. And I was like, see? Told you they weren't just fairy tales. So we just had creative ways to keep our history.
Wampanoag communities still live on Cape Cod today. Native American youth Alyssa Harris and Nathan Mills describe the unique challenges they face growing up as Wampanoag on Cape Cod.
What do you think is different now, 400 years later, being a Native person on Cape Cod?
We don't live the way we used to. We don't have as many rights. We used to live in a very sustained, organized way, but it's not like that nearly as much anymore. We can't, we do have our hunting and fishing rights, but because of deforestation and all the construction and everything, there aren't as many animals around, so it's harder to practice what we would have done.
I guess we could say we lost our community.
Okay.
We lost our sense of tribal community.
What would you say it's like being a Native person on Cape Cod in 2020?
It's tough.
There's good and bad parts. It's definitely very interesting because people are quite interested. Like at my job and at powwow, people are like, oh my goodness, you're an actual Native person. But then at the same time, they're like, oh, you live in a teepee, blah, 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 blah. Like, they're very ignorant, but they're also like super excited to see us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How can we improve relations in 2020, do you think, with Native and non-Native people or people of color?
Well, I've noticed at Plymouth Plantation, at first, people were very ignorant and they would say a lot of stereotypical things, but what we did was we put signs up before actually talking to Native people, and it kind of educated them on us, like stereotypes and all that, and it stopped them. So maybe have something online or something that educates people more.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say educating more. Maybe at beaches, have a nice sign that says this was land of such and such. Tell some of the local history, which is, a lot of it is gone and not talked about. The real history, you only hear about the school history and the
European version?
The European version, yeah, the winner's version.
Good.
You don't ever hear about where any of the Wampanoag communities were around here, because there were a lot more Wampanoags than there are now. There's not a lot anymore, but look at all this land. It's very resourceful and very, very rich, very able to live off. So there was definitely a lot of communities and tribes scattered through people's everyday neighborhoods. And things like that should be recognized.
We also remember that history is not simply a thing of the past, but that history is being created today as well. Racial differences and injustice continue to be relevant in our communities. Maryknoll priest Jean Toland speaks about recognizing generations of racial injustice.
Now we have reflection and discussions long ignored, put on back burners, or even buried, on why the inequalities in healthcare, education, and housing exist. I do not know the experience of black people in my own country. I have not walked in their shoes. So despite feelings of empathy and support, Just like being a visitor to other countries and cultures, I have the responsibility to treat with basic respect all black peoples, people of color living and working here, particularly on Cape Cod, such as Haitians and Jamaicans, Brazilians, black Brazilians, but in particular the original peoples of these lands. With them, I must be a humble learner and listener. So I think with the initiative of Eastham 400, we here all have the opportunity to honestly face and accept the past skewered relationships with original peoples of these lands and those black people and their descendants, those who arrived in 1619. But not to be paralyzed by guilt, but with clear eyes and intention to work with them to break the chains of historical, systemic inequality and racism, to reshape how we relate to each other in this our common home.
Moving forward, we work to peacefully build relationships across differences. Wesley Williams, convener for the Martin Luther King Action Team with Nauset Interfaith Association, speaks about the team's initiatives to combat injustice with education and conversation.
With our education task force, we're working with the Mass Committee to basically overhaul their curriculum. We feel that the curriculum is woefully inadequate. It does not teach kids about the real history of relationships in the United States, particularly race relations, But that extends to the history of women's involvement, all kinds of things that were left out. It was essentially a white male curriculum. And so we're basically looking to see how we can help change the curriculum, and also train teachers, because they weren't taught that.
Right. Now, you told us a little bit about working at the state level about education. What about the police? Are you working at the state level or Cape and Islands Association?
Well, essentially, we started with the police chiefs in the Nauset region because we felt we needed to focus. Mm-hmm. We needed to be, and this is where we live, and we felt that we needed to establish relationships with the ones who were here. That really took off. Mm-hmm. We had a series of luncheons where we just got to know each other, because we felt that we needed to establish basic relationships and trust. We didn't want them to feel that they were walking into a quagmire, that we were going to, pounce on them when they came in. We wanted to basically say, like our founder, John Wesley, would say, if your heart be as our heart, give me your hand. You're a human being, I'm a human being. Let's relate on that level. Mm-hmm. And then we can talk about, the whole business of policing, how that applies to the science of policing, the techniques, and all of those things, So expand that. We want to go to another level so that we can reach all the police chiefs in all the 15 towns. But we feel that we've got to start very, very small. We don't want to, again, get off on the wrong foot with these police chiefs that we have not had any relationship with. So we're talking now with 3 of our Nauset region police chiefs with whom we have developed a relationship so that we can perhaps, frame the conversation that we want to have when we start in the fall.
Eastham 400's goal of building relationships extends across town lines. We strive to learn from and about neighboring communities here on Cape Cod. Cheryl Jaffe, museum coordinator at the Wellfleet Historical Society, shares information about how the town of Wellfleet has commemorated local history.
We have been working hard all winter on an exhibit entitled Before 1620, Who Was Here? And that is focusing around what we have found in our collection of artifacts, Native American artifacts that were in a case upstairs at the museum, and they'd never really been cataloged properly, and they'd never really been analyzed or looked at carefully by people who really are knowledgeable about those kinds of things. So we've taken them out of the case, and we wrote a grant from the Mass Humanities, and they awarded us this grant, so we were able to hire an archaeologist and a Wampanoag historian, as well as being able to talk to other people as consultants along the road. It's been quite an interesting collaborative process.
Collaboration with neighboring towns is also important when considering the early English settlement at Nauset, which included Eastham, Orleans, Wellfleet, and Truro. An important part of this early community was the church. Dallas Jones, vice moderator of the Federated Church of Orleans, now speaks about this church's history.
The congregation that meets now on Sundays at the Federated Church of Orleans is the same congregation that had its origins back almost over 375 years ago in Eastham. It all began in 1644 when 7 of the most prominent families from Plymouth, total of about 49 souls, moved to an area called Nauset on the Lower Cape. They bought the land from the Nauset tribe, and it includes what we would now think of as Orleans, Eastham, Wellfleet, and Truro, and a little chunk of Chatham. In order to establish a town there, they had to have a church and a minister, so the first thing they did was to build a church. In 1646, the Nauset Congregational Society was formed, and the town was established. A few years later, it changed its name to Eastham. This was the first church on the Lower Cape. It was about 20 feet square. We have a model of it that was built by George Katz. It was built of native red oak, and a couple of the planks from it are still available and still can be seen, were preserved in the Eastham Tool Museum. Okay, they give a real sense for how solid this building was. It looks more like Fort Apache than it does like a white steepled New England church that dominates popular imagination. Instead of windows, they had slits to fire muskets through to repel attackers. No attacks ever came, but they were prepared. The church was located next to Old Cove Burial Ground, which can still be visited. It's on the eastern side of Route 6, just south of Fort Hill. A beautiful, very small old cemetery with amazing tombstones dating back to the 1600s.
The significance of our local histories, however, extends far beyond Cape Cod. Marie Kestenzon, museum director at the Harwich Historical Society, reflects on her archaeological work regarding Native Americans throughout the East Coast.
I did grow up here on the Cape, but most of my archaeological work actually happened in Florida in the southeastern United States. And what I'm going to be talking about today came from some archaeological work that I was doing in Florida, which was examining the material culture of what we have left behind from not only the original indigenous population in Florida, but also the Spanish settlers and their missions. Spanish got to Florida, there weren't the type of resources that they found in other parts of the world that they were colonizing. There wasn't gold and silver that they could import or export back to Europe. There really wasn't anything there worthwhile to them. Even the people themselves they saw as kind of primitive savages of very little value, not only for Europe, but also to help them make a settlement. So right off the bat, they were not really open to any sort of relationship or any positive relationship with them. there really wasn't any sort of need to establish a colony there. It wasn't anything that would aggrandize them in the eyes of Europe. And these Spanish settlers were desperately clinging onto this European identity. They didn't want to really adapt to this Floridian landscape and rely on any sort of indigenous influence to help them survive there. Whereas up here, you've got these pilgrims coming over from England. They're already an oppressed people. They understand what that's like. So when they came over to this new world, for them it was a new and better life. So they were very open to having positive interactions because they knew they needed it. They needed the help of the people already living here. So you have, when the pilgrims get here, they meet with natives who are already versed in English. They have relationships, whether through fishermen or, in the case of Squanto, being in London and having this first-hand knowledge of English. So the people they encounter to them are not primitive at all. They already have this understanding of English. And to them, they're like, oh, these are sophisticated people. Let's be more open to them. But also we need to rely on them in order to survive. They needed their help to establish a colony there. They were much more willing to cooperate rather than subjugate, at least initially when they first arrived.
I hope you've enjoyed this series of programs about the 400th anniversary of the first encounter as much as I have being part of them. It's important to note that Eastham has a very distinctive and rich history when it comes to the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, a history that we have not always been able to fully understand. And thanks to the Eastham 400 Committee over the past year, we've had lectures, we've had campfire series programs, we've had the 99 Sunset series episodes, all dealing with the history surrounding the first encounter. We've also been able to hear the voices of the Wampanoag people, voices that have not really been heard fully as we recount this history. So it's important for us to take note at this time as we re-examine our own history, learn more about our town, and our relationship with the people who came before us.
I'm super proud to be Wampanoag because knowing how our lifestyle was, just the way that we lived pre-contact is so fascinating because we didn't have racism. Being like part of the LGBT community was actually like looked up upon instead of looked down, how it is sort of nowadays. We were insanely healthy. People nowadays think that we're getting taller and healthier and living longer. Yes, we are compared to Europeans, but not compared to Wampanoag people because they were like 6-7 feet tall living up to 135 years. I've never heard of that from an English person. So that's pretty impressive to me. I think people should normalize changing their opinions when provided with new information because I feel like people just like to stick with what they know instead of like opening their minds and like learning. I want people to like actually start to learn not only the winner's perspective of what happened, but also like I want people to hear all sides of the story so then they can understand and kind of get a common ground of what happened because since people are only hearing the English point of view, they don't really get everything that they need to know. And it's not their fault that they don't know, but I want people to have the opportunity to learn and understand better.
Reflecting on the past year's events, recognition needs to be given to so many people that I, the Eastham 400 Commemoration Committee, and the town of Eastham are indebted to for contributing to this American legacy. We thank all of the individuals and groups who shared time, historical knowledge, and personal treasures for all to benefit.